I remember that morning like it was yesterday, even though it's been 15 years. The sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, soft and ordinary, but nothing about that day would feel ordinary ever again. I had just finished breakfast, fumbling with my cereal, when I saw the look on my dad's face. It was a mixture of shock, disappointment, and something sharper, almost predatory, like he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. My stomach sank, the first cold jolt of dread creeping in. I had always known secrets had a way of catching up to you, but I never thought one of mine would bring this level of fury. He slammed his hand on the table, making the mugs rattle. His voice cracked, high-pitched and unforgiving, as he accused me of a betrayal I hadn't intended. Words tumbled out between us, escalating faster than I could respond. My mother stood frozen, neither intervening nor offering a lifeline. Within hours, my world, my home, felt ripped away. I was shoved toward the front door, a trembling bundle of disbelief and humiliation. My room, my belongings, even my favorite books were left behind like I had never existed. The neighbors might have seen me leaving, bags in hand, shoulders slumped, but I barely registered anything beyond the ache in my chest. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the finality of it all. I walked into the driveway, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Shame and confusion twisted inside me, a knot that refused to loosen. I glanced back at the house one last time, and the door seemed impossibly far away, yet painfully close in memory. I never thought I'd see them again. Even before that day, life had always felt uneven, like I was standing on the outside of my own family. My father's attention was never mine to claim. It was reserved for my older sibling, the one who always seemed to do no wrong. Birthdays, school achievements, even casual compliments were quietly, deliberately handed to them, leaving me to watch, invisible. I remember the way he would smile proudly when my sibling brought home a certificate or a trophy, while my own accomplishments were met with a brief nod, almost perfunctory, before he moved on to something or someone more important. The small betrayals were constant. Forgotten lunches, ignored homework struggles, unacknowledged efforts. My mother tried in her own gentle way, but her support was soft and cautious, never enough to counteract the cold disregard I felt. Looking back, I see the pattern clearly now. Favoritism that was subtle enough to be overlooked by outsiders, but sharp enough to cut deep into my self-worth. I learned early to measure my value by their approval, a cruel and shifting standard I could never meet. The whispered comparisons, the passing comments that made me feel small, the laughter at jokes that excluded me, they all accumulated like tiny shards of glass in my memory. I carried them silently, never allowed to voice the hurt, internalizing every slight until it became part of who I was. The tension in the household was constant, simmering beneath polite smiles and family dinners. I learned to read every glance, every tone, every pause, hoping to avoid another disappointment, another invisible dismissal. Those years left a deep mark on me, one that shaped my understanding of trust and love, a foundation that would later crack entirely when the secret came to light. My childhood was never just about being young. It was about surviving a subtle, constant judgment that I couldn't escape. The first nights outside my family home were the coldest I've ever felt, and not just in temperature. Every sound of the city, cars, distant laughter, footsteps echoing off walls, reminded me that I belonged nowhere. I had no plan, no one to call, no home to return to. Sleeping on couches, friends' floors, even in a cheap motel room, I learned quickly that independence came with a bitter cost. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the shame was heavier than the bags I carried. I tried to avoid people, afraid they'd see the brokenness I felt in every tremble of my hands, in every hollow look I gave the world. The worst was the holidays. I'd walk past my old neighborhood, glimpsing lights and windows, hearing faint echoes of laughter, and know my family was celebrating without me, as if I had never existed. My chest tightened with each memory of missing birthday dinners and family traditions I had once taken for granted. Invitations came to others, but never to me, and the sting of exclusion burned in ways I couldn't explain. I learned to navigate survival alone, finding food, earning enough to pay rent on a tiny room, doing menial jobs that left my body aching but my mind restless. I became hyper-aware of every slight, every rejection, as if the world was silently judging me for the secret that had cast me out. Nights were the worst. I'd sit in the dark, listening to the hum of life continuing somewhere without me, and I'd ask myself if I'd ever feel belonging again. The isolation became both a cage and a forge, shaping a person who could endure long enough to survive, and eventually rise. The secret that had shattered my life wasn't something monstrous or cruel, yet it had been enough for my father to cast me out without a second thought. I replayed it endlessly in my mind, each memory sharper than the last. I had made a mistake, yes, but it was human, forgivable, something that should have been met with guidance, not exile. Late at night, alone in my cramped room, I whispered the truth to myself, over and over, tracing the sequence of events that had led to that catastrophic morning. The unfairness of it stung worse than any punishment I could have imagined. I could see it all as clearly as if I were standing there again, my father's eyes blazing with betrayal, the words tumbling like stones from his mouth, my mother silent, complicit through inaction. I had been thrown away for something minor, and the injustice festered inside me, a quiet fire refusing to die. Anger mingled with sorrow until it crystallized into determination. I would survive, I would grow, and one day, they would see what they had lost. I promised myself, with every aching step I took in those first uncertain months, that the world would eventually reveal the truth. And when it did, my absence would weigh heavier than any punishment they could ever conjure. One day, they'd regret this. The years that followed were relentless, a blur of exhaustion, learning, and relentless persistence. I worked jobs that left my hands calloused and my back aching, but each small paycheck felt like a tiny victory over the helplessness I had once known. Nights were long, filled with studying, applying to positions I never thought I deserved, and learning skills that would one day make me indispensable. I lived frugally, counting every cent, surviving on instant noodles and coffee that barely warmed my soul. The contrast between then and now was staggering in my mind. The powerless, discarded teenager who had left home with nothing, and the person I was becoming. Resilient, resourceful, and quietly formidable. Slowly, the world began to acknowledge me, though I never sought validation from the family who had abandoned me. Promotions came after sleepless nights. Opportunities arrived after years of proving myself, and I started to build not just financial stability, but influence and respect. I learned how to navigate people, how to read intentions, how to turn adversity into strategy. Every small achievement felt like a secret triumph over the past, and with each one, the memory of my father's cold eyes fueled me rather than hindered me. Eventually, I moved into a modest apartment of my own, then a house, each space a testament to the independence I had clawed from life itself. There were quiet moments when I imagined them, still trapped in the patterns that had hurt me, unaware that I was no longer the child they could dismiss. I had become someone they would recognize only in the mirror of circumstance, and that realization, unspoken, fueled a burning desire for the day I could finally confront them. I had risen from nothing, and the powerless child they once discarded was now someone who would not be ignored. After years of relentless work, I finally began to see the fruits of my labor in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. My name, once invisible within the walls of a home that had never valued me, started to carry weight in the world outside. Promotions, accolades, and small victories became stepping stones, each one quietly proving that I was no longer the child they had dismissed. People who had once overlooked me now sought my advice, my presence, and even my approval. Invitations to exclusive events arrived in my mailbox, opportunities that had been impossible when I was scraping by, struggling to keep a roof over my head. And yet I never told them. Not a word reached the ears of the family who had cast me out. I imagined the whispers if they ever found out. The shock of realizing the person they had discarded had transformed into someone formidable, respected, and admired. The contrast between their ignorance and my reality was intoxicating. I was living a life they could never have predicted, thriving in a world they assumed I would never touch. Every achievement felt like a quiet victory, a secret celebration that belonged entirely to me. FOMO began to take shape in my mind, not for me, but for them. Someday, they would realize what they had missed, what they had lost, and that knowledge would be as sharp as any confrontation I could orchestrate. For now, I relished in the quiet, unspoken triumph of simply being seen and acknowledged by a world that mattered. It started with subtle hints, casual mentions that drifted into conversations I knew my family might overhear. A distant cousin would remark, almost in passing, "Did you hear about my name? They're doing incredible things now." At first, I barely registered it, choosing to keep my world separate from the one that had rejected me. But the whispers grew louder, seeping into circles I knew my parents frequented, friends who had remained loyal to them. I imagined the slow realization spreading across their dinners and gatherings, their old routines, comfortable in their assumptions, now colliding with truths they hadn't anticipated. The contrast was delicious in my mind. They, stuck in habitual complacency, unaware that the child they had discarded had not only survived, but thrived. Each snippet of gossip, each mention of my name, tightened the coil of suspense inside me. I could picture their confusion, maybe even the quiet panic as they began to piece together a world they had assumed I would never enter. The thought of them, still wrapped in their ignorance while my life flourished, made my pulse quicken. For the first time, I felt the subtle satisfaction of power, the knowledge that their perception of me was completely outdated, and soon they would have to confront what they had lost. 15 years had passed since I last set foot near the house that had thrown me out, and I had long convinced myself that I would never return, not willingly at least. So when the knock came, sharp and deliberate, my heart lurched like it had been yanked from my chest. I froze, hand hovering over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to let whoever it was leave without acknowledgement. But the sound echoed again, insistent, deliberate, and I realized it carried a weight I couldn't dismiss. Who could it be after all this time? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Part of me wanted to retreat, to hide behind the walls I had built around myself over the years, safe in solitude. Another part, sharper and darker, urged me to confront it, to face whatever had the audacity to disturb my carefully constructed life. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. My pulse hammered in my ears while memories of the past, the pain, the humiliation, the endless nights of wondering why, flooded back in vivid waves. I took a shaky breath, bracing for whatever revelation awaited on the other side, knowing that once I opened that door, nothing would remain the same. I didn't expect to see them again. Not like this. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize the people standing there. Time had not been kind to them, or perhaps I had changed too much for their familiar eyes to register. Their expressions were cautious, polite even, but tinged with that subtle superiority I had known so well. The same dismissal that had once made me feel invisible. And yet, the power dynamics had shifted entirely, though they had no idea. I stood tall, calm, and composed, the weight of years spent building myself into someone formidable settling comfortably on my shoulders. My presence alone seemed to make them pause, a momentary crack in the confidence they had once worn so easily. They looked at me, expecting perhaps the timid, uncertain figure they had cast out, and I could see the flicker of confusion, the fleeting whisper of recognition that they hadn't anticipated. For the first time in the years since that terrible morning, I felt the authority, the quiet control, that had always been denied me. I let a small, almost imperceptible smile play at my lips as I realized how profoundly the tables had turned. The questions, the polite inquiries, the subtle attempts to reclaim dominance, all of it met a wall of poise and self-assurance I had cultivated painstakingly. And in that moment, I knew the first real reckoning had begun. I held the power now, and for the first time, they had to step into my world on my terms. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of 15 years of absence and resilience. "Do you remember why I left?" I asked, letting the words hang in the air. Their faces shifted, hesitation, confusion, a flicker of guilt, but no one answered immediately. I continued, recounting the incident in precise detail, the mistake they had blown out of proportion, the small truth that had been transformed into a reason for exile. Each word I spoke drew a visible reaction. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes welled. My siblings shifted awkwardly, avoiding my gaze. It was as though they were seeing the event for the first time, stripped of their justified anger and inflated blame. I described the fear I had felt, the nights of uncertainty and hunger, the silent suffering, and the way I had survived despite their rejection. I wasn't perfect, I admitted aloud, but your reaction wasn't about justice. It was about control. My voice carried a quiet authority that demanded acknowledgement, not defense. The shame on their faces was undeniable. For a brief moment, I saw my father shrink into the man who had thrown me out, stripped of dominance, confronted with the unnecessary cruelty of his decision. I felt a surge of vindication, not through cruelty, but simply by standing there, whole, confident, and unwavering. Their guilt filled the space between us, thick and heavy, and I let it linger just long enough to be noticed, enough to plant the seed of recognition. They had underestimated me, and now they understood the cost of their choices. Internal thoughts churned alongside the dialogue. Memories of the years I had spent rebuilding, the resilience I had forged from neglect, the quiet satisfaction that I had survived and grown beyond their reach. I had finally transformed the injustice into my strength, and now they were confronted with the truth, unable to deny it or diminish it. The revelation left a tense, charged silence in the room, a pivot where the past and present collided, and I realized that the path to final reckoning had begun. I waited for the right moment, knowing that subtle satisfaction wouldn't be enough this time. This was the reckoning they had never imagined, the undeniable demonstration of everything I had built while they remained trapped in the past. I invited them to a small gathering, under the guise of a casual family meeting, knowing full well the world outside would be watching, even if only indirectly. As they arrived, their casual superiority flickered into unease, eyes darting around, trying to gauge what they had walked into. I had arranged for a few acquaintances, mentors, and colleagues whose influence carried weight in ways they could not ignore. As introductions were made, I saw their discomfort grow, the realization dawning slowly, painfully, that the person they had cast aside was now someone who commanded attention, respect, and authority. Each subtle nod I received from the guests, each polite greeting, served as a quiet hammer blow to their ego. My father's posture stiffened, my siblings' lips pressed thin, my mother's hands fidgeted nervously. I spoke with ease, sharing anecdotes and insights, my voice carrying confidence that demanded recognition. Every question they posed, every comment they tried to make, was met with the knowledge that I controlled the room, not aggressively, but effortlessly. I could see the internal struggle in their eyes. The same dismissal they had once assumed was permanent was now shattered. This was my moment of public vindication, my carefully orchestrated reversal, and it felt exquisite. They were witnessing firsthand the consequences of their cruelty, and the weight of realization pressed upon them with unmistakable clarity. As the evening progressed, I allowed small glances, meaningful pauses, and quiet affirmations to highlight the contrast between who I had been and who I had become. No words were necessary. The atmosphere itself communicated the message. The powerless child was gone, replaced by someone they could no longer underestimate, and they were finally forced to acknowledge the truth they had once tried to erase. I looked at them across the room, the family who had shaped so much of my pain, and I let the silence stretch long enough for them to feel its weight. I could see the flicker of guilt in their eyes, the awkward shuffling of feet, the unspoken apologies hanging in the air like fragile glass. My voice was calm but resolute as I finally spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness," I said, letting each word land with deliberate care. "But respect is not optional." The room seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the gravity of what I was saying. I recounted, not angrily but with precision, the years I had survived, the struggles I had endured, and the life I had built despite their choices. Their expressions shifted from shock to sorrow, a painful recognition of the harm they had caused. My father's eyes lowered, my siblings' hands clenched, my mother's shoulders slumped. I could feel the power in the balance, the knowledge that my boundaries were now unshakable, that my life could no longer be controlled or diminished by them. Internally, I reflected on the journey, the discarded child, the lonely nights, the relentless pursuit of independence, all culminating in this moment of quiet authority. The bittersweet nature of it hit me. The satisfaction of being recognized for who I truly was mingled with the lingering ache of what could never be undone. I had achieved closure without needing their validation, asserting my worth on my own terms. For the first time in my life, I felt both free and firmly rooted, a person shaped by hardship but unbowed, standing strong with clarity and dignity, leaving no doubt about who I had become. Sitting alone that evening after they had left, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief that I hadn't anticipated. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of expectation or resentment pressing down. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the betrayal, the hunger, the endless nights of doubt and fear, and I realized how far I had come. Every hardship, every lonely struggle had shaped me into someone resilient, resourceful, and unshakably self-reliant. The memories of my family's rejection still lingered, but their regret no longer had the power to wound me. I had transformed their cruelty into strength, their dismissal into motivation, and their ignorance into my triumph. The moral was clear. No one else defines your worth. Your actions and perseverance do. I reflected on the subtle lessons in patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence I had learned along the way, understanding that revenge was not just about confrontation. It was about rising above, standing tall, and commanding respect without losing myself. A bittersweet satisfaction settled over me. Their remorse would echo in their lives, while I moved forward free, whole, and validated on my own terms. The chapter with them had closed, but my story was far from over. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was the author of my destiny. The days after the confrontation felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. I woke up without the familiar ache of anger or anxiety pressing in, replaced instead by a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had reclaimed my life. My routines shifted naturally, guided by my own choices rather than the expectations or judgments of others. I pursued passions I had delayed for years, spent time with friends and mentors who truly valued me, and embraced opportunities that once would have seemed impossible. Each step forward reinforced the truth I had worked so long to prove. I was capable, deserving, and free. The past, with its pain and betrayal, remained a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I allowed myself to hope without fear, to dream without restraint, and to love without hesitation. Occasionally, I thought of my family, their regret, their surprise. But these thoughts were distant echoes rather than wounds. I had built a life of my own making, one filled with purpose, dignity, and the kind of happiness that cannot be taken or dismissed. Standing on the balcony of my new home, watching the city below, I felt the finality of closure. Life stretched out ahead, full of promise and possibility, and for the first time in 15 years, I embraced it entirely, empowered, free, and ready for whatever came next.